So I read that your father murdered your mother when you were 10 years old.
11.
11 years
11.
old. So tell us what happened.
So it was the, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll give you the sort of the abridged version.
Right.
So my parents were going through, my father was a doctor. I grew up in a very small town called Mansfield, Ohio. And if your audience doesn't know that, if you've seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption, that's where it's shot. If you've seen the film A Murder in Mansfield, that's what it's about. But it was a very small town, and my family was all from the East Coast, from Philadelphia. I had spent the first 5 years of my life in Virginia, and then my father, who was a doctor at a naval base in Virginia, got a job at this small town in Mansfield, Ohio. And we moved there, we didn't know anybody, and I grew up what I felt was like was a normal life, but I was a constant companion to my mother, and education was placed in really high regard. Both my parents went to Penn. They were city kids from Philadelphia, but that was like everybody went to Penn at that time. They were scholarship students, and so I learned education had a really high value in my home, and I think that ultimately I come back to that because that's what led me through this, is building the resilience. But my father was a chronic womanizer, but I didn't know this. And it wasn't until the summer of 1989 on Father's Day when I saw my father make out with another woman that he introduced me to, who I'd met before, and she had a ring on that looked like my mother's. And then he asked me to lie to my mom about it. And I did at that time. And then the next day, I was so overwhelmed with guilt because I'd never lied before in my life. And I went to my mother.
When you were 11 years old?
This was when I was 11.
And so you went to your mother?
I went to my mother and I told her, I said, I think Daddy's having an affair. He told me to lie. I'm really sorry. I've never lied to anyone. I've never lied to you. And she said, I don't appreciate you lying, but I appreciate you telling me the truth. But I'm also angry that your father put you in that position and asked you to lie. And then she went on the phone and she was yelling. I went in the other room and was yelling. And so ultimately what happened over the next 6 months is my parents were engaged in a very nasty divorce. My mother was a very wonderful, beautiful, classy woman, educated, tax smart, quick wit, just a wonderful person, very caring and compassionate with everyone. And that's where I learned all that from. And so my father, who was a narcissist, he was very abusive to us growing up. He was a rageaholic. He had a temper. He was very, he would become apoplectic, and he, at the drop of a hat. And I dropped an egg on the floor one time, and I remember him he started screaming at me and telling me he was going to kill me and my mother, and then kill her. And he slammed the door and broke all the windows in the door. I mean, all these things, right? He was very violent, but he was leading a very duplicitous life, which I had no idea of. And then I came to find out this was a girlfriend, and then what had happened is on December 31st, 1989, so December 30th, my father brought my grandmother, who was his mother, who was very close to my mother, to our house for New Year's. And she was sick with pneumonia, so she didn't come for Christmas that year. And my mother had adopted a 3-year-old girl from Taiwan about 6 months before this, so right before the girlfriend and all this stuff had happened, that I knew of, at least. So I had a sister, her name was Elizabeth, and she was 3 years old, from China. And so my grandmother came to the house, I kissed my mother goodnight that night, and I woke up at about 3:18 in the morning to a scream. And then I heard, separated by about 60 seconds, 2 loud thuds. I heard my father muttering, and I was frozen in my bed. And I kept saying, I think this is happening. I think something's happening to my mother. And to sort of give a little bit of context to this, about a month and a half before that, my father was just becoming nastier and nastier with us, and he wasn't staying at the house, and he was, obviously with his girlfriend. And so when I would split time between my parents, I would see the girlfriend. It was just really weird. But my mother came to me and she said, we were driving to go get some dinner after school, and she said, if something ever happens to me, Collier, she said, I know I would never leave you. So if something ever happens to you, I want you to know that your father probably had me killed. I was like, oh my goodness, like what? And I was like, no, Mommy, that would never happen. So this happens in the middle of the night, and I hear my father muttering, and then I count about 12 footsteps as they walk down the hall. I was a child that always slept with my door open, and I was laying there with my eyes open, and I'm saying to myself, don't look up. And the feet stop in the doorway, and I can see them out of my peripheral vision. I'm like, don't look up. Because I know, and I know now, and I knew then, that if I had looked up, I wouldn't be here. Because it's not that difficult to make the hole a little bigger and say, oh, she left with the kid in the middle of the night.
So you think your father would have killed you had you looked
100%.
up?
100%.
And why do you think that?
Because my father's a psychopath. Because my father was planning, had premeditated to murder my mother for months before. My father had bought a house in another state. My father had bought her quote-unquote burial shroud, which was a tarp that was sitting on our front porch for 6 months before that, and including the indoor-outdoor carpeting, this AstroTurf carpeting, sitting on our porch for...
Y'all knew it was to kill your mother?
I didn't know it at that time.
Oh.
No, of course not. No, of course not. But I later at the trial, identified all these things. So what happened is that he left. I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning. A few hours later, I ran straight to my mother's bedroom, looking for blood, and I noticed that she wasn't there. Obviously, the bed was in a state of disarray, like not left how she normally would. I come downstairs. My father's sitting on the couch with a towel wrapped around his waist. He had just gotten out of the shower, and I said, "Where is my mother?" And he was watching CNN. He didn't even look at me. And I said, "Where is my mother?" And he looked at me and he goes, "Well, Collier, Mommy took a little vacation." And I knew right then and there, I was like, game on. So he goes into this whole diatribe about how we're not going to call the police, we're not going to call the FBI, which I thought was really weird. It's like, we're in a small town in Ohio, FBI, like, what are you talking about? But it's very weird. But he leaves, and my grandmother says, well, your father said don't call anyone. I was like, okay. So my mother had just gotten a cordless phone, and I grabbed the cordless phone, and I went upstairs to my bedroom, and I had saved, because of this little caveat for my mother a couple of months beforehand, I had saved all my mother's friends' phone numbers on a piece of paper that I stored in this little Santa Claus Garfield that I had.
So you're 11 years old.
11 years old.
I just want to remind the people, you're 11 years old. All this is happening.
Mm-hmm. So I take that little piece of paper, I go into the bathroom, I lock the door, I start calling all the numbers, and I tell them what I heard, what happened. I said, my father said not to call the police, so I'm not calling the police, I'm calling you. So a couple hours later, police show up at our house, 2 uniformed officers. My grandmother is livid, yelling at me, saying, "You called the police." I said, "I didn't call the police." It's very true. I didn't call the police. And but she was helicoptering over me like a hawk as we walked through the house, so I wasn't really able to talk to them. The only thing I did say to one of the officers is I said something that my mother always said, which was, I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him. But they left, and my father came home that night, and his lawyer came over, his divorce lawyer, and he's speculating where my mother could have gone, and we're having this big family conversation, and I'm just thinking to myself, man, you're delusional. But I'm watching him like a hawk, because I'm making notes.
You were convinced that he had killed your mother?
Or done something to her at the very least.
Oh, okay.
Because you don't want to think that really happens, right? You don't really want to go there.
Yeah.
But you're like, she's gone, so I'm going to process that, and I'm going to deal with that first. So my father then, he was moving to Erie, Pennsylvania with his girlfriend, and he was going to start a new life and all this stuff, because he was going to get divorced. My father made plenty of money at the time, and and he was really screwing my mother over in the divorce. But he was a really, because he was very nasty. He's a narcissist. So he's just, she wanted to divorce him, so that's the issue with him, right? So it's not his fault that nothing's his fault, right? Even though he was a fornicator and had multiple affairs with countless women, even simultaneously. I mean, for years this has been going on that I didn't know about.
How did you find out?
I found out all this after the trial and everything. And as I got older, I started finding out these people would come out of the woodwork. And then when I started the podcast, people coming out of the woodwork, telling me stories. I mean, it's wild.
So your father was a slut maker?
I don't know if he was a slut maker. I don't know what that means. But my father was. A
man that has sex with a lot of women and not married.
I mean, I would just say he was a womanizer. I mean, whatever you call slut maker, promiscuous, a philanderer, whatever you want to call it, a charlatan. whatever, it's all probably all of the above, if you will. But he, so the thing that happened is, so this is January 1st now, 1990, and I had called my mother's friends and I said, again, up in the bathroom, I said, what's going on? And they're like, well, we filed a missing persons report. And I was like, okay, he's done something to her, so what's happening? So by the grace of God, or whatever you want to call it, a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant David Messmore, it was New Year's Day in a sleepy small town in Ohio, and he happened to see the missing persons report, and he goes, this is interesting. Doctor's wife goes missing on New Year's Eve. So he comes to the house. And my grandmother's yelling at him at the door, won't let him in. He's like, oh, I just wanted to come talk. Is the doctor here, this and that? And I'm like, come on in, you know. So my grandmother loses it. She goes to call my father. And when I was a kid, my mother would tell me stories of growing up in Philadelphia and riding the carousels, you know, like the horse carousels.
Yeah.
And she always told me that the whole object, you pay the nickel to go on the carousel, and you could win a prize by grabbing the brass ring. So my mother always told me, grab the brass ring in life. And I knew at that moment, when my grandmother leaves and I'm alone with the detective, that was a brass ring moment.
Oh, I see.
And I looked at him and I said, something has happened to my mother. My father's done something to her. My mother would never leave me. Give me your card. I'm going to school tomorrow. Give me your card. Gives me the card. My grandmother comes back, yelling at him. He goes, okay, I'll come back later to talk to the doctor. So he came back later that night, wouldn't let him in. My father's there with his lawyer and the whole thing, his divorce lawyer. The girlfriend comes over that night to serve pork roast and everything. It's just super weird. But the next day when I go to school, I walk right into my principal's office. I give her the card. I say, you need to call this man right now and get him down here. And David Messmore came down to my school. And for 3-4 hours, I lay out the entirety of my parents' relationship and my experience with my father's proclivity for violence. He was, how he treated us, the whole thing, the events of the night, like everything. And he's looking at me like, who is this kid? Because I was almost 12 years old, but I was still 11. And I say to him, I'm going to go home, and when my grandmother is downstairs making dinner or dealing with my sister, I'm going to run upstairs and I'm going to pull the bookcases out of the wall, because we have crawl spaces upstairs, to see if I can find my mother's body. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to look to find her purse, because my father's claim was that the thuds that I had heard in the middle of the night was my mother throwing a purse at him and threw all her credit cards at him. His story was they got into a fight. She was yelling at him. She threw her purse at him, threw all her credit cards at him, walked, because she confronted him downstairs on the couch, had walked out of the house in the dead of winter, December 31st, 1989, walked down our driveway in the middle of a snowstorm and got into a car that was waiting for her at the end of the driveway. That was his story. That was his story at trial. That was his story with me. She left in that car, and which I knew was nonsense, right? So, I laid out all these things for him, but, so I'm looking for a purse. I'm telling him, I'm going to just start looking for clues and building this case against my father. And I had contact with Dave Messmore every day, and I would call him for updates, because my father came home with scratches. My father always had well-manicured hands. It was a point of pride for him. He had cuts all over his hands. And I noticed, and I was like, okay, mental note. He asked me to rub his shoulders one night with Ben Gay, because he was really sore, said he was moving boxes, and which is like a muscle relaxing ointment. Yeah. Then the really odd thing was my father, who used to abuse me for not watching violent movies with him or covering my eyes if there was blood or sex or anything, like a good little boy, right? I don't want to see these things. I'm a child, right? Mostly probably out of fear that my mother might whoop my ass if she knew I'd watched a bad movie. But no, in all seriousness, and I was playing, I had gotten a Nintendo that year for Christmas. I was playing a fighting game, and my father said, what is this game you're playing? This is violent. I never would have bought this for you. And I thought, who are you? Who are you? Who is this man? But just his really bizarre behavior is coming out from him. And I could notice over the course of several weeks, he was getting more and more stressed, and but he wasn't abusive. He was becoming very passive. the real turning point in all of this was I'm going to school every day. My father is leaving.
What grade are you in at that time?
I think whatever, fifth grade? Yeah, fifth grade. I
Fifth
guess.
grade.
Yeah, fifth grade.
At 11.
Fifth grade, sixth grade? Does that make sense? Yeah, fifth grade. Fifth
Did
grade.
you tell your friends that your father had killed your mother at school?
Well, I mean, I told them.
Yeah, they were missing.
I told them I'm looking for my mom. Like you know, everybody's speculating, right? And I no, I guess sixth grade, right? Is that what?
Something like
sixth
that.
grade. I don't have children, so I don't know.
Right.
Sixth grade, because I'm trying to think. I stayed another year in the school, and then I left. Okay, so yeah, because I went to public school when I was in eighth grade. So yeah. Anyways, I was in sixth grade. So, one night my father says to me, this is middle of January, around January 15th. He says, I want to take you, he's like, I need to go to my office to get some paperwork. And of course, I'm watching this man like a hawk. So I go with him to his office to pick up paperwork. We stop at a gas station on the way back home. And he goes in the gas station. And again, brass ring opportunity here, brass ring moment. I'm watching him through the dashboard, and I start rummaging through his truck. And I open up the center console in the truck, and I find two photographs. One is of a house that I've never seen before. And the second one is of his girlfriend, Sherry, with her two children, sitting in front of a fireplace that's been wrapped in plastic. I thought to myself, that looks like a new fireplace, and this is a new house. I go next to the school. I tell them about the house. I said, I found this house. The girlfriend is there. This is not a coincidence. And I tell Dave Messmore this. Well, that's interesting. What happens is I don't hear from him for a couple of days. And I'm checking in with him, but he doesn't come to the school or anything. But around January 21st, 22nd, 1990, my father comes to me, and as I said, over the course of these weeks, I can tell there's more and more stress and pressure, but he's not acting out on it, being abusive or anything. But I can tell he's under some duress. And he says to me, he goes, this has been really stressful, the way that mommy has left us, has left our family, because it was always her fault. She left the family. She, has left us to fend for ourselves. I think that it would be really nice for us to have a father and son bonding trip. I have a medical convention coming up in Florida, and I think you should come with me, and it'll help us bond. It'll get your mind off your mother and stuff. Now, every year, my father, we would go as a family to Clearwater Beach, Florida for a medical convention. That was in the spring, not in the dead of winter. It was in the spring because it's spring break. Kids can go. You can go to Busch Gardens. You can go to the beach. You can do all that. Not in the middle of January, end of January, right after Christmas and holidays. And I knew at that moment that he told me that, I'm not coming back from Florida. That he's on to me talking to the police, because Dave Messmore is showing up to our house every single night wanting to talk to him. The press is coming now. His lawyer is there. So I'm sure he's trying to figure out, how are they getting this information? They're nosing around. They're asking questions. But I, again, go to school that next day after he tells me this. And I said, Dave, he wants to take me to Florida. And I've been able to swim since I was 4 years old. I'm going to drown in the Gulf of Mexico mysteriously. I'm not coming back. And
amazing.
On the morning of January 24th, 1990, 2 agents from Children's Services woke me up at 6 a.m. and said, you have 20 minutes to pack a bag. We're getting out of here. And I could hear a bunch of commotion downstairs, and I knew that this was real. And I asked if I could take my dog, and they said, we'll come back for your dog. I never saw my dog again. I packed a bag for myself and my sister. I come down. My entire house is flooded with investigators, men and women in white lab coats, police cars everywhere, the whole thing. They are searching. They're serving a search warrant in my house looking for my mother's body. I didn't go to school that day. I go to the principal of my school's house. And
you go where?
To the principal of my school's house.
Oh, okay.
And I get visited by a woman who says she's a caseworker. Now, I don't know what a caseworker is, but I know if you have a caseworker, it's probably not such a good thing. And she basically says to me, your father, nobody can find your father. I'm like, yeah, you think? That night, as I'm saying, because I was asthmatic growing up as a child, I had probably the worst asthma attack of my life. And I thought I was going to die. I didn't have my medicine with me because it was at the house, right? And the house is a police crime scene now. But the next morning, as I'm fighting for every breath that night, something else is happening in another state. And I go the next morning to the hospital to get a breathing treatment. And I remember walking into the lobby of the hospital. And these are all people I knew because my father was a doctor. I would go on his rounds with him and talk to patients and go to the hospital. So I knew people. I was a very personable child. And they pushed me away from an honor box. For those of you that don't know what an honor box is, it's where they keep newspapers. You put the money in and you can only take one newspaper. That's why it's called an honor box. But I remember being ushered away from that. And there was a ton of people in the hospital, in the lobby. Got the breathing treatment. And then from a family friend, and then they said to me, Collier, Lieutenant Messmore found your mother.
They found her?
And she was dead. Now, it is very difficult to articulate how that feels, because the cruel dichotomy of all of this is that one part of you is relieved that for the last month you haven't been going crazy, that what you believed was true, was actually true. But there's this overwhelming sadness that the person that you loved more than anything in this entire world is never coming back.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And that the person who is responsible for that is your father. And I knew right then, that's to cross the Rubicon, right? That's it. My life as I know it will never be the same. And I testified a couple days later at the grand jury, securing my father's indictment. I was then abandoned by both sides of my family. My mother's side of the family.
Let me ask this first. How long once they told you your mother was dead, how long did it take for the trial to happen?
6 months.
6 months. So in between that time and 6 months, what were you doing?
So a couple days after that, I testified at the grand jury. They secured his indictment.
Right.
Then both sides of my family told me, my mother's sister, my godmother, said to me, "We can't take you in. You look like your father." They lived in Baltimore.
You look like your father?
I don't look like my father. I look like my mother, but I'm male,
That's
so
what
therefore,
they told you, though?
That's verbatim what they told me.
They say, "I can't take you in
We cannot
because
take
you look
you
like
in
your
because
father."
you look like your father. Yes.
This
Because
is your mother's sister.
this is my mother's sister. This is my godmother. I grew up
Amazing.
Catholic. This is my godmother. They're good practicing Catholics. On the flip side, my father's side of the family, my father's brother especially, was like, "Well, we're gonna get you. You're gonna say that this is all made up. Your father's been arrested." Because my father's a psychopath and a master manipulator, so he has essentially convinced the entire family that this is all a bunch of nonsense. It's utterly fanciful that he could ever do this. He's perfect, which of course is not true. But so I was remanded into the foster care system, and for the next 5 months, as the star witness of this trial, I had to sort of live in pretty much. I was allowed to go to school. I was not allowed to watch television. I wasn't allowed to read the newspapers. It was all over. It was the big. Imagine we live in Los Angeles, right? Imagine the O.J. Simpson trial was here. That's what this was like, where I grew up, in a town of not even 30,000 people. National media was covering this in parts, and I shudder to think if TikTok and social media and all that stuff was happening now, if that had happened then, what my life would have turned into. The conjecture and whatnot. But it was, in the film, there's somebody that says it was they're interviewed saying it was like a movie. It's like a soap opera in our own town. People were, it became this thing, man. And
what was the name of the movie they made?
So I made a film called A Murder in Mansfield.
Oh, okay. And did you play? Who played you?
No, so it's a documentary,
Oh.
and I'm playing myself.
And so they found your mother. I read that they found your mother's body at this new house.
They found my mother's body buried underneath. On the night that I'm having that asthma attack where I think I'm going to die, police are literally exhuming my mother's body from a shallow grave that my father had dug underneath the basement floor of this house.
At this new house.
This new house that I found the photographs of that I tipped the police off to.
That's amazing. And when you heard that, what was that like hearing that he had buried her under cement like that?
Oh, all of it was just, again, like I was saying, it's so hard to put into words that everything that you thought was true, because you hope that you don't want this to be true, but you also, it's like, oh, I'm not crazy. Like, I was right. But, like, who wants to be right in that situation?
Yeah.
Like, it's the worst feeling in the world.
But what's interesting to me about hearing you talk about it now is that you was 11 years old going on 12 there, and you had the mindset that you had to deal with it once you were missing and the way you dealt with it.
Yes.
To me, you don't normally see 12 years old thinking that way.
No.
And where did you get
But I was
that?
not a normal 12-year-old.
You abnormal?
100%. So, I mean, like I said, I was the kid who would leave, you get off on summer vacation. I get to play with my friends for a week, then my mother would put me back into summer school, learning either art, music, science, all the above. Like, my parents were both very into education. I didn't grow up. I grew up with TV, but I didn't grow up. My parents were not like, here, sit down in front of the television and that's going to take care of yourself.
Right.
My mother was my constant companion. I spent 99% of my time with my mother. So my father was always gone, working at the hospital or whatever he was doing, but obviously having all these multiple affairs and relationships.